So, got it? Yep, great. Okay.
And I'm just going to say a quick welcome. So welcome on behalf of the Taos Institute to this Taos conversation. It's April 10th, 2024, and we're here with David Kenkel. Thank you so much for hosting this conversation today and for sharing your doctoral work with us. So you can take it from here.
My absolute pleasure. I'm going to share a little bit of a PowerPoint first, but hang on, let's go. Where have we got now? I want to, oops, sorry, wrong one. I want to share this one. Yes. Okay. So I'm going to move you folks slightly out of the way so you're not in the way. So I just wanted to, I've sort of been thinking about the title of this, and I'm thinking about glamoured hopes and bitterly beautiful hopes, because I think hope is an extraordinarily important thing, but it can also be an extraordinarily destructive thing. And a little bit about the background of how I got here. I did a master's a long time ago in which I call the odd name of futurity, because I was fascinated with governmentality, the conduct of conduct. And I got very interested in how it is that young people are inducted into taking on the kind of epistemological subjectifying norms of neoliberalism, in particular, short-sighted thinking, self-interest, an accent on the self. And I got really deeply curious about, and one of the ways that seemed to be done was by a constant focus of talking about what you needed to be in the future to be successful. And what I think sparked my fascination was I was working a lot with very deprived families at the time, and saw lots of educational posters about, the future's in your hands. And I began to think, what an absurd notion. Of course it's not in your hands. It's in the hands of a larger socialist construct. And if you're told it's in your hands, all you're going to do is feel guilty about the fact that your future's crap. So I wrote a master's on that. And the conclusion to the master's was kind of grim, in that I realized that we had a sociological societal recipe for creating short-sighted, short-thinking, self-interested, non-collective kind of peoples, and actually right at the very moment where we actually needed the dead opposite. Hello, Finn. David Kenkel, my name. We've just started, so just right at the very period of time where we needed the dead opposite, which was people who could think collectively, could think far into the future, rather than I have to admit that in the beginning stages, my hopes for this thesis were that I'd come up with this sort of homily to save the world. That's when I first started it, the PhD. And what I've realized over time is actually the world as it exists is post-saving, that we can't save it, that we can't stop the majority of the changes that are coming, that they are inevitable. So my area of focus shifted then to how people might be different in future than they are now, not in terms of what they do, but in terms of who they be, because we know what we need to do, we just don't do it. So I became thinking about all the best utopian writers. One of the things they tend to do is they tend to not so much tell stories about different worlds, but they tell stories about different norms and different ways of being in the world. And then from those flow very different logics of action. So I became fascinated with that question. So I developed a series of questions that I asked people online. I was lazy. I used a SurveyMonkey, and I got an extraordinarily rich series of replies to questions like, if you think about, the future as being harder than it is now, what might be normal to people in the future that's not normal for us now? How might they be different in how they approach things in the future? And the replies I got were extraordinary. So let's move on a little bit. Hang on, why is that not working? I'm going to have to move you to the other side so I can scroll it down here. So the replies I got were quite extraordinary. Oops, hang on, why aren't you doing what I want? There's a thing in New Zealand called whakawhanaungatanga, which is you introduce yourself. So I want to say my name's David, David Kenkel. I'm of mixed, I describe myself as a mixed European fruit salad. I come from about about 8 different ethnicities, all of which washed up on the shores of New Zealand before and after the Second World War. I now live on the land stolen from Te Kawara o Maki, which is the iwi of this, iwi means tribe of this particular kind of place, of this area. I live 200 meters from the sea, 600 feet for you American folk. In the narrowest part of the island. And 200 years ago, this was the superhighway of New Zealand, where people would take canoes and waka from one harbour to another, saving themselves a sort of 800-mile paddle around the top of the island. So it was an incredibly inhabited place, and it is rich with history. So the land here is evocative. It is. You can't step anywhere without history touching you, without you being able to feel it. And I feel myself to have a role here as what we would call katiaki, which is someone whose job, one of the many people's whose job it is to care for this place. So in my whānau, which is a flash New Zealand way of saying extended family, my mother in particular comes from a line of social activists that go back quite some hundreds of years. And in the last years of her life, one of the things that she came to was that love of place and other are coextensive. That the more you learn to love it, because she had to come to New Zealand and learn to love this place rather than the place where she grew up in, which was the UK. And she realized they're coextensive. And if you are able to love and adore and cherish the place you live in, you're more likely to be able to love and adore the people that live there, and vice versa. So, and I think also I've worked a great deal with Indigenous peoples here because, we're a mixed population group. And the struggle for Indigenous peoples in New Zealand at the moment is very much a reclaiming of hopes. And they are embittered and battered by colonization, the theft of language, the theft of land, the theft of culture. And watching that and being, I guess, part of, as a Pākehā, as a New Zealand European, a good treaty partner, has taught me is that it's an enormously painful journey, that it hurts like hell. There's a lot of agony involved, and it's a community struggle. It's not an individual one. So the families and extended peoples that I know are reclaiming their language, reclaiming their culture, reclaiming their connection to place. Because over here, it's considered rude to introduce yourself as what you do. It's considered appropriate to introduce yourself as where you're from. And land is not considered something that's owned, it's considered something that one is part of, which is very different from our dear old John Smith, who I'm beginning to realize is much more the ideological driver of a great deal of the Western world than I'd first imagined. So that's, so moving on a little bit. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry to say, but there are some bad things coming. Hang on, I'm just going to shrink that a little bit. Do you all remember the Seinfeld show? Yeah, great, wasn't it? I used to enjoy watching it too. Well, since the Seinfeld show started, which I think was about maybe 1990, until the time that it ended, there was more CO2 released, it's carbon dioxide released into the atmosphere during that period of time than there had been in the previous 200 years before Jerry Seinfeld came on board. So the current part per million of carbon dioxide, the last time we had a level of carbon dioxide like that, the sea level was about 100 feet higher than it is right now. So, and it's, sorry, 410 part per million is low. I think it's probably up to about 430, coming up to 500 now. I also, and this was in many ways one of my daughter's contribution, who's a beautiful thinker, is the fallacy of individual efficacy. the notion that individuals making changes and having electric cars and recycling will change the world. When one of those big cargo boats that kind of carries bits of plastic around the world to make cars with eats up in 1 year or it puts out as much emission in 1 year as about 50 million cars, and there are millions of boats like that. We're also locked in endless growth models. And we don't seem to have we don't seem to have the kind of governmental or societal will to change that approach. What's also comes out of all of this previous historical studies of collapse, which have tended to be about single societies, not global stuff, is that the more a society is dominated by rich elites, the worse the changes get, because the rich elites are the last to be affected by it. So therefore, things keep going until they get very bad indeed. More egalitarian societies tend to change quicker. We're not an egalitarian society globally at the moment. We're the dead opposite. And so we're locked into endless growth models. We've also got diminishing soil and water, crop failure, and we've also got what they call positive feedback loops. Those are the kind of things where the ice warms, the ice melts, so the sea heats, so the ice melts, so the sea heats, so the ice melts, so more sea heats. So things get warmer and warmer and warmer in a kind of positive spin. And there are quite some number of positive loops like that are happening right now. So the permafrost is defrosting, which is going to be releasing massive amounts of carbon dioxide very quickly. And we have this wonderful thing called methane clathrate, sometimes described as a methane clathrate gun, which is frozen lumps of carbon dioxide, carbon dioxide, and also other forms of gases, the ones that we produce in our intestinal gut, that sit in frozen lumps under the sea. And when they start to melt, we'll have big pockets of explosive, rapid rapid kind of gases that will increase the Warmhouse effect exponentially, up. The other thing is we've got warfare, xenophobia. More and more people move. Never been so many people on the move as there are right now. And probably, hopefully, never will. But well, actually, no. We're looking at a future there will be. And oh yes, I'm sorry. This is a depressing bit. The wet bulb phenomena, which you may or may not be familiar with. The wet bulb is that if I was to take a good old-fashioned glass thermometer and I was to wrap it up in a piece of wet cloth and stick it in front of a blowing fan, the temperature of that bulb did not drop below 35 degrees Celsius. I'm sorry, I can't remember what the Fahrenheit normal blood temperature is, and you looked about 97, something like that. If it doesn't drop much below that, if your temperature is skin temperature is at 35 or above, which tends to happen when you've got very high humidity and very high temperatures, then the human body can only last about 6 hours before you die. Scientists used to talk about that, this may well happen by about 2150, goodness knows. It started happening about 2019. We're already having kind of cities and countries, the Pakistan-Indian border, the South China Sea, parts off the Americas, some of the most densely inhabited and poorest parts of the world are likely to be hit by the wet bulb. At the moment, those temperatures have only hit that for 2 to 3 hours at a time, but predictably within a decade or two, we're going to have either mega deaths in those parts of the world, or we're going to have huge population shifts. And if I had a choice between staying somewhere and boiling alive or invading another country, I think I'd invade the other country. Makes sense, doesn't it? Okay. So I just wanted to sort of back and forth in time. I had a really interesting experience with my eldest aunt when she was dying. She was born in 1915, and she told me the story of being 5 years old and having the flu and not understanding why everybody looked so worried and so scared. And then she realized, of course, because it was the last remnant of the Spanish flu as it floated around the world and diminished. And she made sense to her then. And so she remembered that as a living experience, which was pretty unusual. And And around about 2020 in New Zealand, we have a lot of gangs in New Zealand, mostly Indigenous and some immigrant groups and some European, a mixed crowd. But in Northland, which is a fairly rough part of our world, or can be, it's a beautiful place as well. One of the things that happened was that when COVID first hit, a lot of the Northland gangs, or a number of towns up there, the gangs blockaded the roads to stop people from coming in. And there was public outcry about that and police outrage and all sorts of things. But I thought about it a little bit harder. And I realized, of course, that because those gangs are mostly Māori and very connected to that they remembered as a living thing the 1918 epidemics, because they lived in a world where that wasn't ancient history, it was present. And there's a whakatoki, which is a saying that says the best way to approach the future is to walk backwards into the future facing the past. Which I kind of like. And also, NB, hunter-gatherer communities are really interesting. One of the things that happens is they always have a few old people that remember all the most horrible things to eat. The stuff that nobody will eat normally, but that's really good famine food. So the capacity to remember that stuff. So back and forth in time. And now we're in the time of the Anthropocene, which is the geological era that is where the greatest effect on the planet is us human beings. And hope is a critical component of what we do now. So I use this picture. This is Tintagel, which is a castle in Cornwall, which was the one that, you know, the legends of King Arthur? Well, King Arthur's father snuck into Tintagel and made love to the queen there under a glamour cast by a spell cast by Merlin, which made him look like somebody else, like her husband. Very sneaky things to do. So, and I thought about that notion of glamour a lot, and so. And one of the things I think that happens is modernity is not just an economic system. It is a cultural system as too. And one of the things it does is it plasters over and silences and cracks the kinds of hopes that don't fit its story. You know, so I'm interested in how those cracks can be to different hopes be prized and kept open. And I'd say to you now, they are smaller and bitterer hopes than we might otherwise, than today's hopes of that we're all going to have flying cars in 5 years' time. You know, that we're all going to live in some sort of future where genetics allow us to live to 200 years old. You know, I mean, those kind of hopes are not. And carbon sequestration will solve the climate crisis. Well, crap. Sorry, it won't. So, ke hete putia, where is the money? It's a Māori saying, and it's often said, who's got the money? Where is the money? Follow the money. And it's a good old structural analysis, Marxist type question. And I always ask this question, you know, who benefits? Who benefits from our current glamours of hope? Who benefits from our allegiance to these discourses and norms? How are we blinded in silence or mocked away for considering other kinds of hope? What bitter, hard things might that lifting that going out expose us to? You know, what bitterness and hard hopes might we have to kind of face that we don't face now? You know, that we can't face now because they hurt too much. Which Indigenous peoples know about facing painful hopes. We are only perhaps beginning to learn about that. So I'm fascinated in that question. And just as an aside, one of the things I found, of course, is that talking about things like societal and ecological collapse are deeply unpopular. It's very hard to kind of speak to audiences because they come and scream to me about, hello, welcome. They come and scream at me about, what about hope? And you can't kill hope. I had a Green politician once. I approached her and said, you know, you do realize how bad things are going to be. And she said, oh, yes, we do know that, but nobody would vote for us if we told them the truth, you know. So I thought, yeah, okay, that makes some sense. But are you all managing my accent okay? I have a fairly strong New Zealand accent. Cool, thank you. I just, so anyways, it's a cultural challenge of facing, not fixing. It's a very interesting notion that we have predicaments to acknowledge, manage, and face rather than problems to fix, which is a very different way of thinking about it, eh? Sorry, that's is a question mark that we tend to put on the end of words sentences. So if we have predicaments to face, rather than problems to fix. What might that mean for us when we are enamored and glamored by the notion that everything can be fixed? You know, what might that mean? Now, I'll just moving on a bit. Oh yeah, I wanted to show you some pictures. This is the beach that's 200 meters from my home. That cliff line there, up until 2 years ago, was covered in trees that were knocked down in one of the huge storms we had from, thanks, global warming. But that is the current high tide line. And this picture here is a tree and a small stream that flows underneath it that I've been associated with all my life. I live in the area I grew up in. I remember as a child, we used to wriggle down the little gap between, you know, there to there to climb down to the beach. That tree is, well, I can vouch for it being at least 65 years old. I've seen pictures and paintings of it from 100 years ago. That stream and waterfall, if you want to call it, it's been there as long, and it is a very beautiful place that I deeply cherish, which is only 200 meters from where I live. And this is what it looks like at full tide. I waded out. The water wasn't so cold. The other picture I had my dog in it, but this is full tide, as it is right now. Okay, and I wanted to just get you to pretend along with me. This is a stone. It's from the stream bed that flows underneath that tree and out to the sea. And I often think about, and it's an iron incursion into sandstone, so it's a little bit harder than the other kind of stuff that sits around. So there's a lot of kind of stones of this kind of nature that float around down there. And I sometimes think about them as listening stones. Those stones have kind of listened to children's footprints running over them from pre-European times. They've listened to my family and the family of many others splashing and playing. They've listened to tragedies of people drowning. They've listened to the stories we tell each other. They've listened to drunken parties on the beach. They've listened to kind of fishing celebrations. They've listened to all of those things. So if you pay attention to things like these, sometimes listening stones can speak back to you and tell you stories from the past, and they certainly do for me. So I brought this one along as an example. I'd love to offer you a rock each, but you're too far away, and I'll take this back to the beach when I'm finished. Well, not yet. I'll do it tomorrow morning. And this is, I went down to my beach. The best predictions at the moment is that the minimum we're going to get is a 6 yard rise in sea level. So I went down to my local beach. I made a 6 meter pole. I used a laser light and some chalk and a level, and I measured out what the high tide would look like with a 6 meter rise. And that's what it would look like. Kind of different, eh? So what can those stones hear now? What can they speak back to us now in that future, where at the very best they may, well, no, actually, I don't think they'd ever be exposed to the air. And I also just want to say something about the slow conservatism of science. Science publications tend to take about 5 years to get through. They're incredibly cautious. The review process means that they almost never say anything controversial. Predictions that are made of, oh, it might happen in 50 years' time, they've got a bad habit of going, whoops, it actually meant 5 years' time. So the sort of predictions of this might happen by 2150 are now starting to be, well, it might be 2100, or actually it might be 2050. The best theorists I've come across suggest that the real cracks are going to start showing in the global ecological and systems about 2030. So we've got about 6 years before massive change hits. I don't know when the sea is going to rise that high, but if I live a reasonable lifestyle, it'll probably be in my lifetime. It'll certainly be in the lifetime of my children. That's big, eh? That's just my beach. Let's not talk about the cities. All right. I am enamored. I'm not a Christian, but one of my favorite saints was Saint Hilda of Kierkegaard. And she talked about veritas, which is a Latin word which means greening power. and it's life's capacity to spring forth, the endless capacity for kind of life to find ways of growing and greening. And so I took this picture of a very small plant growing in a crack in the concrete, because for me, sometimes little small broken plants growing out from damaged places are things of great beauty. So maybe beauty and hope's where you find it. And maybe we need to start looking for those kind of hopes and those kind of dreams. That's kind of so, okay. I'm now going to stop the screen share for a minute and get back to being a real person. So when I did this, I was very interested in Guattari. I don't know how to pronounce that properly. I'm not French. Deleuze and Guattari's challenge, or Guattari's challenge, he talked about back in the early 90s, late 80s perhaps, he talked about the need for different kinds of subjectivities if we're going to survive as a species, different new notions of the subject. And he talked about particularly the mental, the social, and the environmental. So I kind of based a lot of my PhD on his question around that. And I also I just wanted to quote this lovely American author. I don't know what she's written. This was actually from a newspaper or magazine piece. She said this phrase of "caught as we are between the rich and the rising seas." I thought was an extraordinarily evocative kind of phrase. And she went on to say that when almost every headline or television item that comes on could easily become the plot for a new dystopian novel. Perhaps we need utopian stories and stories of hopes more than we ever have before. But I think she's right. You watch the news and there's another dystopian novel in every headline. But there's not a lot of the kind of smaller stories of what might be different. And I want to talk about bitter hopes, because if we're going to have hopes for a future that's different, ways of living that are different now and ways of being that are different now, they're going to be bitterer and they're going to be smaller, and the transition to getting there is going to involve pain. It's going to involve facing predicaments that we currently don't. I had some wonderful surprises from my research. I had based all of my questions around, so in the future, how might people be different and think differently in terms of their relationship with place? I didn't get answers about that. I got answers about community. I got answers about people living more collectively. I got answers about a shift from virtue being about possession to virtue being about kind of relationship, to a notion that the self might shrink, to a kind of that what might become cherished is our relationships with each other in place, that people might begin to understand themselves as part of place rather than owning it. But they would do so in the detritus of what we've left them, which is likely to be. So it will be a harder world, but in many ways a kind of richer one. And there are two. I sometimes think about it as like a very beautiful painting, a stunningly beautiful painting with an incredibly ugly and frightening frame. The frame is what we've got to face. The picture inside it is what we, our descendants, may be like, if we're lucky, in terms of kind of how they approach the world, themselves, and each other. And I think, sorry, I'm just going to go back to this PowerPoint. I'm sure there's something sensible to say. I'm seem to be going faster than I normally do. Okay. Yeah, so I'm interested in that question of, sorry, I've done the wrong thing. And screen share that. We all know what it's like using Zoom, eh? So, it's new and smaller utopias of hope that are kind of different. What might they look like when they've escaped from the glamours of late modern capitalism? How might they be different? So one of the things we do is some bad news. Some researchers suggest that states under pressure become more vicious. So when you have resource-strained states I think you guys are seeing this in America right now. When you have resource restraints, when you have diminishing resources, diminishing water, power, food, people become xenophobic. There's a kind of ugly, the political systems become ugly and more totalitarian. You have horrible rules, totalitarian rules for the poor and not many rules for the rich. Predictably, you'll have techno enclaves of people. I mean, there's large chunks of the South Island of my country that have been brought up by foreigners to create sort of safe space to get away to with, great, enormous concrete underground bunkers. That's a reality that will happen, along with kind of a fairly vicious enforcement of kind of a series of rules, probably primarily designed to keep the status quo going as long as it possibly can. I tend to think it's a little bit like the smoking industry, the tobacco industry, that you squeeze every last drop of profit out of you can of it before it finally becomes impossible to kind of convince anybody to smoke cigarettes anymore. When you squeeze every last drop of profit you can out of the environment until it ain't got nothing more to give. But you need an enforcement regime for that. So that's the bad news. But the good news is rather lovely, actually. This comes from a guy called Fritz, who did his main work during the Second World War when he lived through the Blitz, and then went on to study communities around the world that have faced crisis and disaster. And he'd expected to find traumatized people, but he didn't. He found kinder people. He found people that pulled together. 20, 30 years after catastrophe, people still valued interdependence in ways they hadn't previously. Solidarity became the new popular game. And strangely enough, even after the most awful of disasters, 5 to 10 years later, people were happier because they were connected. There was a kind of relational something that happened in consequence to that. I'm going to stop that one. I won't get into that now. I'll just ask. So what hopes might we have to give away? And I'm kind of interested. I've got my own ideas about what, damn it, I might have to give up having a credit card, if the banking systems collapse, which they probably will. Oh no, I might have to give up Netflix, there's a whole bunch of things I might have to give up. What do you imagine? What are some of the painful things that you imagine that if we have an ecological collapse with incredibly diminished resources, that we have a collapse of global trading, or the restriction of that to small amounts of goods for very rich people, and the collapse of our economic systems as they are right now? What do you imagine you might have to give up? What are the things that you look at, you think, oh, that's a horrible thought, that I'd have to stop doing that? Just curious from people. Anybody got any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, private homes,
Yeah.
private cars,
Yes.
private transportation. Um, yeah, that whole notion of mine, ownership, basically.
Yes, and I think, ownership is a fascinating. The notion of ownership is incredibly new in the world.
Yeah.
One of the things that fascinated me about the PhD was the answers that I got from my respondents were very similar in terms of the values and ways of being in the world that are known from hunter-gatherers. Hunter-gatherer communities are groups of people who do not have agriculture, that live hand to mouth, as it were. You catch and eat what you've got today. Maybe you can dry things for a little while, but that's about it. And they have an extraordinarily rich value systems, and they have character ideals that they enforce in a whole range of ways, everything from kind of the way they raise their children, to teasing, to group exclusion, Coventry, being sent to Coventry, to at worst execution. So, and their greatest sin is the refusal to share meat.
Hmm.
Second greatest sin, if you like, for them is to big note yourself, is to act like you're the boss, is to behave in ways as if you have the right to tell other people what to do. and they have no notion of individual ownership.
Mhm.
You know, I mean, maybe you own the clothes on your back, apart from when you've lent them to your brother. You know, but that's about as much as it goes. So ownership and Adam Smith notion of no, not Adam Smith. You know who I'm talking about. The chap that the American Constitution was largely based around. He had the notion that if a resource is not being used, then it should be. That property is the most important right for governments to defend, and that progress cannot happen without it. Well, look where that's got us. So some of the things that I've imagined that I'm probably going to have to might have to give up is easy access to doctors. I might be able to still get to them, don't know.
Some
So
would say that we already have given that up, that it's very hard to get an appointment with a doctor.
right, yeah. Yeah, well, and that'll probably get worse.
Yeah.
We're lucky in New Zealand. We've got a socialised medical system, so we can still get to doctors reasonably cheaply. But I'm not so sure that will last. Social welfare systems and benefits won't last. They're already crumbling like crazy. Supermarkets. I'm going to miss my local supermarket. Trustable police and courts. You know, if you think the police are bad now, imagine if their primary job is to enforce the status quo in whatever way is necessary. And we're seeing that happening around the world now. Overseas holidays, damn it. I really like going to Thailand. It's close to New Zealand. It's a stunning place. I've got friends that live there. It's really cheap. The food's great. I'd love to steal one more trip back there, but I think that's probably about it, you know. Regular electricity. Don't know about that one. What people may not be aware of is that we live in a world where most cities hold at maximum about 10 days supply of food, and that food is dependent on a highly petrochemical kind of transport system. So if that begins to crumble, you know, the supermarkets will empty really quickly within days. The warehouses that support the super houses will empty within weeks, and you know, there she goes. I'll have to give up going to the mall, which I quite like going to the mall. And I'll have to give up cheap foreign-made shoes and clothes. So I won't be able to wear Nikes and such like anymore, and I won't be able to throw them over my clothes and buy cheap Chinese import ones anymore. So and it's interesting. A lot of the people who responded said that the virtues of frugality will re-emerge. Because we're not.
We not stopped doing that already, though. Like
It's beginning.
we're doing.
Pardon?
Surely, if we all that you're speaking about, surely we're putting these things into practice and looking for regenerative ways of growing crops for textiles, and we're doing all that stuff, aren't you? Know, well, I know I am, but
Yes.
yeah,
No, I don't disagree with you, Finn. I agree. I mean, that's, you know, thinking about it from a social constructionist point of view, you're always looking for exceptions, eh? So there's a glamour of kind of progress that's been thrown over us, that everything that a techno-fix will fix the world, and there are always exceptions to that. So the future emerges in small places around us constantly, and that was one of the questions I asked: is where do you see these things happening now? And they're in exactly the places you've just described. And I think a lot of people of the respondents also suggested that one of the things that will happen is that those, as you say, knowing how to make your own textiles, knowing how to grow your own food, knowing how to about local markets rather than supermarkets, you know, or knowing all of that range of kind of skills will provide kind of the seeding for what's needed in the future. So there's a lot of things we won't have to reinvent, but it doesn't take away from the fact that the kind of the trajectory of the world right now is towards some degree of ecological collapse and some degree of societal collapse accompanying it, including, you know, so you're right. I mean, that stuff's happening, and I think. I mean, it's kind of interesting. Most of my respondents answered in 2016. I wonder how they'd answer now, you know. It's not many years later, but quite differently. And when I talk to young people, people under the age of 35, because we're the first generation in quite a while since the Second World War where our children and grandchildren are going to live in much harder worlds than we do. You know, the notion of upward mobility is a dead dream. You know so when I talk to young people, is it's kind of like everybody knows, you know, everybody knows that we need to move back to that kind of level of frugality, to living collectively, to kind of having those sorts of skills. And there are many people around the world who are already experimenting with that, and there's indigenous groups who have been skilled at it for hundreds of thousands of years. And I think they will provide the kind of seeds of knowledge that we're going to need in the future. But that doesn't remove the fact that some bad, pardon me being crude, some bad shit's coming down the line, you know. And we will have to endure and face that. You know, we can't, you know, and that's why a lot of the theorists that I like are suggesting that we need art, culture, and collectivity is more than we need science right now. You know, science is great, love it. You know, I'm really interested in it. A lot of my stuff's based on hard science data. You know, and I read a lot of stuff around that area. I'm not uninformed, but it's not going to fix things. It'll provide some useful frameworks, but what we do need to do is so how do broader societies face mass grief? I was not able to find the book again, but many years ago I read a book. It was a simple book called The History of the English Village. And it went right back to kind of pre-Roman days, right through to the modern days. And there was just one page where it mentioned that when the Romans left the UK, because the Romans were very good at agriculture and horticulture and all that stuff, and it's quite a tight little society while they were there, the population dropped by about 70% over a 40-year period. I know. So it kind of went, I don't know, I can't remember the numbers because I couldn't find the damn book again, but it kind of went from something like, you know, they had 10 million people living there, and 40 years later they had sort of 3 million people living there. And the numbers didn't creep up again to those sort of numbers until about 1700. And to imagine what that time must have been like, of collapse, of dissolution, of warfare, of the loss of kind of skills, of the trading networks that allowed food to be brought in at times like that, it is horrifying, you know, and we're facing that again. And how do we face that with grace? You know, how do we both grieve and hope at the same time? Are really critical questions for me. So our hopes are likely, our utopias are likely to have a degree of bitterness in them, but I think they're important bitterness to face. So I won't delve into the thesis and read out some of the things. For me, so what might some of your beautiful hopes be like? You know, even if bitter as they may be, what might you hope for the future to be different? I mean, I've got this. I started daydreaming about it yesterday, and I've got this lengthy list. But I'm only one person. If you imagine your great grandchildren's lives among the broken detritus of what we leave them, what will their lives be like? What will they cherish? What will their hopes and dreams be? What will their utopia look like? How much will it be laced with bitterness and anger toward the past or not? Or will they forgive us? You know, I mean, that's one of the questions I asked. Thinking of the notion of the outsider witness, I asked the question of if our descendants could look back at us and ask us the questions. You know, why? You know, tell us about their experience now. What would they have to say? And the questions ranged from they would hate us and despise us, through to they would be graceful enough to have learnt the art of forgiveness. It's a strange notion that our great-great-grandchildren may need to look back at us with pity, sadness, and the capacity to forgive, you know, what we've left them with. Marx predicted the last stages of capitalism where it is when it turns on itself and begins to eat itself, you know, where societies begin to eat themselves alive, but there's no more resources to exploit, so you resource what you can. At the moment, we're eating our children, you know, we're eating our children's futures. So what do you think it might be like? I mean, I've got some ideas for what my future utopias would be. A lot of fun and laughter, you know. And imagine a lot of time sitting around small fires with kind of people kind of talking and giggling and laughing. I'd really like to know someone who knows how to look after someone when they're sick and dying. I have noticed an increasing tendency, if you have a major illness or if you're facing death, to go to a hospital or a, you know, terminal care place or a hospice and get looked after by professionals. But I also know, because in a previous incarnation in my life I was a nurse, that there are many skills that are very basic around how to look after those in physical distress that are kind of simple and basic, but require a great deal of kind of skill and knowledge. And it's skills and knowledges that have been lost. Not many people know about how to turn people over when they're sick, or how to wash someone in bed, or how to keep people hydrated, or simple pain relief kind of mechanisms. So I really hope there's someone in my community that knows about that kind of stuff. I think it'd be great. And I'd really hope there's midwives. Because I'd like my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren to be able to give birth with someone that has got some idea what they're doing, even if they don't kind of have electric lights and kind of ECGs and kind of ultrasounds to monitor the size of the baby. And I hope for okay, yep, all right, soon. Thank you for good question, good point.
Yeah, sorry that I have to leave early. I've just got a client that I have to see now.
Yeah, my
Thank
clients
you
don't arrive until tomorrow morning, thank goodness.
Thank you so much.
That's
Bye.
all right, my pleasure. I also really hope for good neighbors, you know, good neighbors I can trust. And it does kind of seem like when you have catastrophe, you know how we've got a bad habit of not knowing who our neighbors are right now, or maybe waving to them as you're driving out in the morning to go to work. That's about all you know. Well, things change when times get tough. I mean, we've had massive floods and electricity cuts here in the last 5 years. And all of a sudden, people are banging on each other's doors, and especially the older ones. And do you have enough water? And can I, you know, would you like some soup? And, you know, but those kind of, but extend that into actually, you know, that field over there. Well, I think we all need to get together and clear it so we can grow some potatoes on it. And I know it belongs to somebody else, but what the hell, we're going to take it anyway, you know, and hopefully they won't mind too much. You know, but good neighbours I can trust and share and work with is for me a utopia that is beautiful, where we would also get together, you know, and kind of party it up. And I really hope there's someone in my local locality who knows how to make good booze, you know, and grow good pain-killing drugs, you know. And I dream of I dream of enough water to drink. You know, I've got a stream 200 meters away that is a trickle, and the idea of trudging down there to kind of have to collect it in small plastic containers, which will inevitably not last more than 2 generations, and then pottery ones, you know, is very tiring. So I hope there's enough rainfall in tanks that I can collect water to drink. I hope there's enough to water my gardens. Our summers get very, very dry. Without watering, it's almost impossible to grow crops. That's tricky when you don't have electricity to kind of pump the water systems. I dream of local seed networks, you know, seed exchanges, you know, places where people share that kind of stuff. Markets with other communities. That seems to be a feature of both hunter-gatherer societies and the research people that came through from me, was that we'll probably have a time where people live in fairly small collectives. And you're right, Sheila, you know, private ownership of houses may disappear. So there'll be groups of people living together, but they won't necessarily be isolated from the broader communities around them. You know, they'll get together, they'll talk, they'll share knowledge. Will, you know, basic principles of community development will re-emerge in terms of that the other one I really hope for in my vision of utopia is that we have an ethos of restorative justice, not punitive justice, in how we live. So if the police become if the police become the terrorists that we're all afraid of, who drive around in tanks using up the last of the petrol and shoot anybody that they disagrees with them, and we can't use those, and we need to manage justice in our own communities, will we be able to kind of find ways of doing that in a restorative and generous kind of way rather than the punitive kind of fashion? And I think we probably will, but there'll be a transitional shift. I know that the prepper movement in the United States is all about kind of individual. It's very popular in the States. It's not so much here, but I gather it exists in other places too. It's all about people living in sort of armed camps, shooting people that can't come near because they might steal their food. I don't think it's going to be like that. I don't think it's going to be like the Mad Max movies. I'm sure there'll be pockets of that, but that's based on a hyper individualized notion of the self, and I think that's going to fade away. I think the smaller self will re-emerge. So fitting in might become more important than kind of than having a strong sense of who you are. So I also think one of the things that is inevitable, like I live in a country of 6 million people. An 8-hour plane ride away, probably a 5-day boat trip away, there's 200 million people living in Indonesia, who about half of whom will kind of lose their islands and places to live when the sea rise happens. Are they going to stay there? Hell no. Are we going to be able to keep them out? No. Are we going to fight them off and treat them like enemy aliens? Well, I hope not. I hope there'll kind of be an ethos of welcoming, of welcoming the other rather than xenophobia, or of cherishing difference and finding ways to incorporate it. Because that's really critical. Because at the moment, the climb and right-wing xenophobia is extraordinary, but I'm not. My vision is that there will be a time post that, where the stranger who speaks another language and has other cultures and other foods and other ways of doing things becomes a cherished guest, not the terrifying invader. I think a local place to keep and share books. I've got a nice library up the road. But it'd be great if there were some local librarians that kind of kept all the books that, the stories, the information books, all of that stuff. It's a lovely notion, so academia won't go away. It's just going to refigure itself, and I really want them to be a few good storytellers, If electricity becomes erratic, I can't watch Netflix anymore, Occasionally I can kind of hand crank a radio to pick up a signal from somewhere else, but that's about it. Then having a few good storytellers around to hold our histories and to amuse us is going to be critical. As is having some really good musicians, or even bad musicians, to entertain my life. I really hope, I know people that are very good at hunting and fishing. I'm not. I'm a terrible fisherman. I throw bits of string in the water and nothing ever gets caught. But I know other people that catch them all the time. I hope I've got a few of those floating around. I think there's also some useful and edible animals in shared care that we can look after together. Would be a beautiful thing. And you have to remember that the vision I'm talking about would also necessarily be taking place through a period of continuous climate change, where the weather would not be predictable from year to year, where there'd be famine and feasts, where there'd be kind of good years and bad years, dry years and hot years, cold years, wet years, invading years, all of those sort of things. So this will be episodic. It's not a solid state, vision that kind of goes like this, but there will be pockets and moments of it that I think my hope is will be enough to sustain us into the future. I personally do an awful lot of canning and bottling because, I'm not for any particular ecological reasons. I just like doing it for fun. I just hope there's lots of people that are really good at that. The other one is that, we could in my country, cut down all of our native forests and turn them into farms. We could kill off all of our native birds and turn them into kind of chicken batteries, you know. Or we could find ways of cherishing things for their own sake, not for their utility. You know, and so if I'm so that question emerges for me is what will we regard as sacred and worth cherishing in the future, that at the moment is a nice extra add-on, but maybe in future something that needs to be fought hard to protect, you know, when because the notion of every animal you know, larger than a rat dying off is rather unappealing to me, you know. So that will happen unless there is a concerted effort amongst people who are probably also engaged in struggles to stay alive, to cherish the local beautiful things, the animals, the plants, the trees, the birds, and to try and kind of keep those stories alive. So those are some of my thoughts. I know you're out of time.
On the time. I'm sorry to interrupt you.
Those are that's my vision of a beautiful utopia, but it will be one where probably we also get together and cry like hell from time to time and sing stories of loss and grief, you know, you know, and look back at the past with regret, longing, anger, and sadness, you know, as well as those beautiful little kind of things that we might need for the future. So that's pretty much all she wrote from me. I'm interested in other people's thoughts about, you know, if you imagine a utopia in the future that is smaller and laced with bitterness of regret and loss, but also beautiful, what might that be like? What might be contained within it? How might we share it? And I'm glad that the Taos Institute is beginning to pick up that. It's been very much my vision too, to kind of pick up ways of how do we keep dialoguing about that? How do we keep sharing those resources? How do we talk about how we're going to manage the movement into a very different world? So, yep.
Well, thank you so much for sharing this with us today.
Yep.
And the recording will be available, and there is the Taos Institute Commons online community. So hopefully we can continue the conversation. I invite you, David, to contribute there, and everyone else can add their comments so that we can continue.
Thank you. And I must say, I just want to say, you know, I can't. This is the thesis. I weighed it. It's 2 pounds. I was going to get it leather bound, but I thought, no, I won't. I'll just do it myself. So I did it with duct tape and string. So there's only one. It costs a fortune to get them leather bound, so I probably will one day. But you know, consider this the thesis of the future that's held together with duct tape, string, and hope.
Thank you, David. That really important conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you very much.
I've enjoyed it much more than I expected to.
Now you can go back to sleep.
Well, yeah, something. We'll go for a walk with the dog, I think. Go and have a look at the